Mr. Cruel is the moniker for an unidentified Australian serial child and who attacked 3 girls in the northern and eastern suburbs of Melbourne in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Police suspected that Mr. Cruel may have been responsible for at least a dozen other heinous attacks on children over a 10-year period. They believe that he would have committed a number of minor offenses as well, such as stealing underwear from washing lines to touching himself while window peeping before graduating to abduction and Mr. Cruel was also suspected of abducting a 14-year-old girl from her Hampton home in Melbourne's southern suburbs in 1985. Bound, gagged, and blindfolded, the girl was taken to a vacant lot, and several hours later, scared and scarred, the girl's body was dumped at Moorabbin Bowl on the Nepean Highway. His 4 most significant crimes involved the abduction and of 3 young girls, and the 4th being a murder. But despite the number of crimes that Mr. Cruel was believed to have partaken in, he's never been caught, despite the loads of information provided by key witnesses and the investigation into who he was. Today, we will be looking at Mr. Cruel's profile, his 4 main victims, the investigations into his abductions, the primary suspects, and finally, inconsistencies that lie among the years of prolific information on this Australian serial killer on today's episode of The Conspiracy Files. Alright everybody, so I've wanted to do this episode for a very long time. Mr. Cruel has always deeply captivated me. The sketch, the evidence. The sketch is just one of the creepiest things I've ever seen. And this guy was targeting children for an extended period of time, and he was never caught. And this, happened a decent while ago, but not long enough that the person would most likely be dead. So who knows? I mean, especially if you live in Australia, Mr. Cruel could be your neighbor. He could be in a retirement home right now, being fed by a nurse, wheeled around, having a great end to his life. And as time goes on with all of these cases, as we always talk about here on the show, the likelihood that these crimes are going to be solved just keeps on decreasing. And with the criminal that was as smart as Mr. Cruel and as deliberate, I don't know if this will ever be truly solved. But I do have to say that this is an incredibly disturbing case. So listener and viewer discretion is advised. Please be sure, if you're watching the show on YouTube, to leave me a comment and like the video, because that helps boost the video. Please watch it all the way through. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave me a 5-star review, because I love hearing from you guys. I love the community that we're building here. And yeah, it just helps the show so much. Without further ado, I want to thank Rebecca Whitworth. If everybody could thank Rebecca for her work in helping bring this story to you guys, let's talk about Mr. Cruel. But before we get into Mr. Cruel and who this unidentified man could be, we need to talk about his crimes and his victims. The first crime and victim attributed to Mr. Cruel is known as Jane Doe. Jane Doe was only 11 when this happened to her. So, on August 22nd, 1987, a man wearing a balaclava with that kind of creepy stitching on it broke into a family home in Lower Plenty, Victoria at 4 in the morning, armed with a knife and a handgun, by removing a pane of glass from the living room window. This man, Mr. Cruel, forced Jane Doe's parents onto their stomachs, tied their hands and feet behind them, and locked them both in the wardrobe of the house. Mr. Cruel then tied up the couple's 6-year-old son to his bed using surgical tape, and then proceeded to the 11-year-old girl known as Jane Doe. Additionally, Mr. Cruel had cut the phone lines to the house, and when he left, he took a few vinyl records and a blue coat, but left no clues behind. The victim to this day has never been publicly identified, and according to a crime story map produced on Amazon Web Services, Mr. Cruel said the following things. To Jane Doe's parents, he stated, "Be quiet and don't move or I'll hurt someone. Get into the wardrobe and sit down. Get into the closet and kneel down. All I want is money, food, and clothes. How much money is in the house?" And in addition, he said to the 11-year-old girl, the victim, "What's your name? How old are you? Clean your teeth. I'm going out now, so count to 100 slowly, then you can free your parents." So nothing really incriminating there and nothing left behind. Something you're going to see in this case that is major is this guy was incredibly intelligent. He left behind no trace of himself. There was no DNA. There were no footprints ever left. There was literally nothing. This guy was in and out with surgical precision. Now we arrive at Mr. Cruel's second victim, 10-year-old Sharon Wills. Sharon Wills was kidnapped from her Hillcrest Avenue home in Ringwood, Victoria, at about 4:50 in the morning on December 27th, 1988. That morning, Mr. Cruel broke into the family's home via the back door, wearing that same balaclava and armed with a handgun, kind of the same thing that he did with his first victim. He also immediately bound and gagged the young girl's parents and demanded money from them. And finally, he grabbed 10-year-old Sharon, put tape over her eyes and a ball gag in her mouth, and abducted her. Before leaving the house, though, Mr. Cruel stopped and collected a few items of Sharon's clothing, and then proceeded to take her to an unknown location. They still don't know where he took her to this day, to which Sharon later recalled details of, saying she believed that she was held somewhere in the Tullamarine Airport flight path. Again, an Amazon story map reported Mr. Cruel as saying the following to Sharon's father: "You're not going to be a hero, are you?" And he also said to Sharon, "You're going to have a shower. You have to wash yourself really good and brush your teeth." Weird obsession with teeth that this guy had. That's something you'll see throughout all of these cases. Sharon gave her description of what occurred next in the following statement. When she was dry, the offender dressed Sharon Wills in the shirt he had taken from the basket in the Wills family lounge room and put her inside 2 garbage bags. He pulled the bottom garbage bag up to her neck and taped it to her shoulders, while he put the other one over her head and taped it to her waist. Then he made a hole in the bag so that she could breathe before carrying her to a car and placing her on the floor in front of the front passenger seat. The car wouldn't start at first, and as the offender, Mr. Cruel, struggled to start it up, he told Sharon that, quote, "Stolen vehicles do not always start properly," end quote. Once he had the car started, he reversed it out of the driveway and drove for what Sharon described as a long time, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. After some time, Mr. Cruel stopped the vehicle, got out, and lifted Sharon out of the car with the garbage bag still on her. He then began jogging while carrying Sharon, stopping now and then to put her down while he rested. After an unstated period of time, the man put Sharon down and, quote, "told her how to get to a nearby Food Plus store," end quote. The offender then removed the garbage bags and blindfold and told Sharon not to look at him as he left. She was released 18 hours later near the grounds of Bayswater High School and was found later walking along Orchard Road in the nearby suburb of Bayswater, traumatized but still alive, dressed in the garbage bags. On July 3rd, 1990, in Canterbury, Victoria, Mr. Cruel broke into a family home at around 11:30 p.m. armed with a knife and a gun, and wearing, once again, that balaclava with that very distinct stitching. The victim this evening would be Nicola Linus. Nicola's parents were at a party at the time, and Nicola and her sister were rudely awakened that evening by the monster that was Mr. Cruel as he broke into their house. Immediately, Mr. Cruel tied up the sister before forcing Nicola to find her school uniform. Then he tied and gagged 13-year-old Nicola Linus, placed tape over her eyes, disabled the phones in the house, and searched for any money he could find. He then stole Nicola's parents' car and drove her around the block before putting her into a second car, where he then drove her to another house and her for 50 hours. At least 5 different times he the 13-year-old girl, before he eventually released her at a power substation in the suburb of Kew. Nicola was fully clothed and wrapped in a blanket with tape over her eyes when she was eventually found. She later told authorities that she could hear aircraft from the house where she had been held captive. Additionally, she told authorities that he had dressed her in a school uniform and her tennis skirt during 2 of the She also shared with authorities that Mr. Cruel had told her he had a schoolgirl fantasy. Mr. Cruel supposedly gave Nicola similar instructions, telling her to clean herself thoroughly and brush her teeth. But unlike the other 2 victims, Mr. Cruel gave her instructions for her release, saying, "You think you're worth $25,000? You will get home." You will be home by late Thursday evening, early Friday morning. I'll drop you off at a place and change your clothes, and you have to wait for 10 minutes, and then you can walk to a police station. I'll give you directions to the police station. When you get back, the police will ask you a lot of questions. Really bizarre. So he's so brazen, actually, that he's dropping the victims off and saying, walk to the police station. I'll give you the directions. They'll ask you a lot of questions. Tell them exactly what happened. And that's how confident this guy was that he would never be caught. And he's a serial. This is the third child under the age of 14 that he is repeatedly and violently, and he's gotten away with all of it. Now, according to Keith Moore's 2016 article citing information found in a dossier, he noted that, quote, Mr. Cruel told Nicola he had followed her from school. Additionally, it's cited that, quote, Mr. Cruel would have been aware Mr. and Mrs. Linus were attending regular farewell functions with different work and social groups. Now, Nicola later reported to investigators that Mr. Cruel had tried really hard to convince her that he was out of the state during the Wills attack, saying, I don't know if it was true, but I do know he wanted me to believe it. But at this point, Mr. Cruel took a dark and disturbing turn. On April 13, 1991, 13-year-old Carmen Chan was taken from her sprawling 18-room home in Templestowe, Victoria, a house that was secured by a 2-meter fence and electrical gates. The break-in happened at around 8:40 p.m., and the man that broke into the house was wearing a balaclava and was armed with a knife. We can assume this was Mr. Cruel. That evening, Carmen's parents were working at the family's Chinese restaurant, but Mr. Cruel knew that. Remember, it's a known fact that he would surveil his victims for days, even weeks before attacking them. So he would have studied this family's patterns. He would have been sitting outside of their home, waiting to see Carmen's parents leave the house. He would have known exactly when Mr. and Mrs. Chan had left the property. After breaking into the house, Mr. Cruel confronted Carmen in the kitchen, grabbed her by her hair, and slammed a bed against the door to trap her 2 sisters in their room. He additionally told her 2 little sisters to get in a nearby cupboard before he grabbed Carmen and abducted her. Before leaving the house, Mr. Cruel left a red herring at the home, spray painting Mrs. Chan's car with the words, "Payback Asian drug dealer," and more to come. Immediately after the disappearance of Carmen, taken right out of her own home, the town of Templestowe held a press conference, with Carmen's parents pleading for her return. Over a year later, Carmen's body was found at the intersection of Mahoney's Road and High Street, Thomastown, Victoria. Nowadays, investigators believe Carmen was killed because she had either seen her abductor's face or because he feared at that point the child could somehow identify him. Her autopsy revealed that she had died from 3 bullet wounds to the back of the head and that her body had been laying at the site of her discovery for approximately 12 months. Her body had been there for about a full year, almost right after the initial attack. And her murder in 1991 marked the end of Mr. Cruel's reign of terror. After this, he fell off the radar, but some had doubts whether that crime was committed by Mr. Cruel or not. On May 16, 1992, following a service at the Boleyn Baptist Church officiated by the Reverend Bill McFarland, Carmen was laid to rest, and her funeral was attended by over 800 mourners. In 2013, Detective Chris O'Connor answered a journalist's question about whether he believed Mr. Cruel was responsible, saying, "We just don't know if it was Mr. Cruel who murdered Carmen. We just can't be sure because there isn't enough evidence to make a value judgment about whether it was or wasn't him in the Carmen case." Additionally, they noted the execution-style method of murder as being indicative of a crime of retribution, as opposed to a motivated murder. In April 2016, 25 years after the death of Carmen Chan, Victoria Police increased the reward from $100,000 to $1 million for information that led to the perpetrator's arrest and conviction. Authorities invested nearly $4 million in the investigation to try catch Mr. Cruel. Up to 40 investigators interviewed 27,000 suspects, checked 30,000 homes, and arrested more than 70 people. But to this very day, they've never been able to identify the perpetrator. Mr. Cruel was believed to have videotaped or perhaps taken still photographs of his attacks, most likely so he could revisit those sick memories. Detectives believe that if Mr. Cruel is still alive, he will have kept those tapes and/or photos and will still collect and possibly swap. Detectives say that he almost certainly continues to collect through the internet and may communicate with children using chat rooms or chat lines. It was stated that Mr. Cruel meticulously planned his crimes, citing a specific example in which he had told Nicola Linus that he would release her in exactly 50 hours, which he did. He bathed his victims carefully, with one victim describing the act like a mother washing a baby, and another saying he was quite caring, trimming her toenails and fingernails. Additionally, in 2 of the cases, he took a second set of clothes from the girls' home to dress them before they were freed. The motive was the same in all 3 of the attacks, possibly 4, and the victim statements provided confirmation to the police that it was actually the same offender. The authorities established the Spectrum Task Force in May of 1991 after Carmen's body was found, dedicated exclusively to catching Mr. Cruel. Like I said before, that task force searched 30,000 homes and interviewed 27,000 suspects at the cost of $3.8 million. There was even a reward of $300,000 offered by the police for any information that would lead to the arrest and conviction of Mr. Cruel. And that infamous reward poster that you've seen many times by now was distributed in 1991 to all Victorian homes and in certain areas in South Australia and New South Wales. In fact, huge posters were even placed in public places like bus stops and grocery stores in the hopes that somebody would recognize who this guy was. But unfortunately, no leads were ever generated, and the task force was officially disbanded by January of 1994. The task force investigated earlier crimes from 1985 to 1987 that had similarities to the Mr. Cruel crimes, but they couldn't locate any witness statements or crime scene exhibits. And that included the tape and rope used to tie the victims. There was just no evidence. The head of the Spectrum Task Force, Dale Sprague, said that some exhibits had not been examined by forensics and had been lost or thrown out. The police established the Spectrum Task Force unit after a review into the effectiveness of their investigations by the Investigation and Evaluation Group found that they needed a more coordinated and professional approach to investigations. Now, on December 14, 2010, the police announced that the Apollo Task Force had been established about 8 months earlier, following substantial new intelligence. The new task force had been reviewing both the Spectrum Task Force investigation and some new leads that had surfaced in the last year or so. The Apollo Task Force, though, closed down in June of 2013 after finding out that that new intelligence wasn't credible, ruling out the suspect. But now for a second, we have to talk about Mr. Cruel and the things that he did and the things that we know that he did. So check this out. Here are some things that we know about this guy. So the Melbourne police describe Mr. Cruel as being highly intelligent. A 2023 article in the Daily Mail noted that Mr. Cruel's brazen attacks were so meticulously planned and committed in such a calculated fashion that he was initially known as Mr. Cool. He was soft-spoken and his behavior was unhurried. During one of the attacks, he even took a break in a victim's house to eat a meal. But who was he? Investigators told us many attributes of Mr. Cruel's profile over the years, listing the following. Appearance. Mr. Cruel was described as being an Australian male in his mid-20s to early 30s, with a height ranging from approximately 170 centimeters to 183 centimeters, and a build varying from slim to well-built, potentially with a slight stomach. He had brown or graying hair, with hair that was sometimes described as having white spots. He also may have had bushy grayish/white eyebrows. His facial hair was noted as either being unshaven with a few days of growth, a mustache, or showing early beard growth. He additionally was noted as having hairy arms, possibly a hairy chest, rough hands, and short fingernails, with no noticeable body odor. He was consistently noted as being right-handed, and wore a dark ski mask or balaclava, with white and red stitching around the eye and mouth holes to prevent himself from revealing too many facial features. An interview with a witness who had come forward in 2022 provided similar characteristics to that description. Take a look.
Description of what he was wearing was a long flannelette, kind of baggy, light jean, very unkempt. He didn't look like he took care of himself, very unfit, very unclean, bit overweight. So he had a belly, round on the face, balding on top, kind of long sides, and his hair was like a medium brown, very pale skin.
But what forensic knowledge do we know about this guy? Mr. Cruel went to great lengths to avoid leaving behind any forensic evidence that detectives could use to catch him. He bathed 2 of his victims to remove DNA evidence. He even went as far as to lay a sheet on the linoleum-covered floor to avoid leaving fingerprints. He transported victims to the release sites in garbage bags, and he made his victims brush their teeth and clean their nails after he attacked them. There was no DNA ever left at any of his crime scenes or on any of his victims. And finally, he even told victim Nicola Linus, "You will be taken to a hospital and they will test you. You will be examined by a police surgeon. They'll be looking for evidence to link me to you, and they won't find anything." How did he find his victims? How did he get into these places, and how did he get out? Well, it was believed that Mr. Cruel's house itself was located under one of 2 main flight paths into the Tullamarine airport. 2 different victims reported to the police that they could hear planes landing after they passed over the location they were being held at. An investigation into flights operating that day determined the likely location of the property as being under either the Tullamarine east-west or north-south flight paths. Spectrum Task Force head David Sprague said that based on how loud the planes were, they may have been just 400 meters above the house. Police searched 30,000 houses in 15 suburbs, including in Coolaroo, East Keeler, Niddry, and West Meadows, without any luck. And I do apologize if I'm messing up the names here. I always try to look up the names, but sometimes you get a pronunciation that's right, and other times you get a pronunciation that's wrong. So anybody watching from Australia, please grant me some grace here. So this guy was very, very meticulous. He left no DNA, no evidence ever that he was even there in the first place. He lived underneath an airport area. There are all these kind of little clues as to who he could be, but something else that threw investigators off that's so perplexing and just bizarre that he did this was purposefully he actually threw investigators some red herrings. A red herring being a false piece of evidence to send somebody, down the wrong path of investigation. Mr. Cruel used those red herrings to mislead or distract investigators from relevant or important information, including red herrings such as the following. During one of the abductions, Mr. Cruel actually pretended to talk to an accomplice, and he also pretended to have been seeking a $25,000 ransom. The accomplice wasn't there, and obviously, Mr. Cruel wasn't doing this for a ransom. During one of the other abductions, he also pretended to make a phone call. He also at times acted like he was looking for money throughout the houses that these attacks occurred in. And finally, he actually spray painted one of the family cars at one of the homes of his crimes. So he was constantly leaving these little clues, trying to lead people down the path of, oh, he might have had an accomplice. Who is he talking to? Does this guy want money? Send the police looking in all these different directions, basically. That was his plan, and it worked. He also had the freedom of movement behind him. Mr. Cruel supposedly slept in till 10 a.m. during one of his attacks, and he was unshaven during the Lower Plenty attack in August of 1987. He abducted 3 of his main victims during or leading up to school holidays, and he was able to conduct extensive stalking and surveillance in the lead up to these, which would mean that he wouldn't have, a necessarily regular job because he was committing these crimes at all hours on, certain days and certain periods. He slept in during one of the attacks until 10 a.m. He didn't have anywhere to be. And it's also been assumed that Mr. Cruel had criminal/tactical experience. You see, during some of these attacks, he used knots that are used by sailors, track drivers, farmers, and fishermen, and was so confident in his ability to tie those knots that he wore gloves when he did it, and he was able to leave adult victims tied up in other rooms, unable to escape. He also knew how to cut phone lines to cut off communications. He also always parked around the corner from the house where he was going to commit the crime, or in front of vacant blocks or houses in order to avoid detection. And finally, he was able to manipulate and use a small black pistol-style handgun. Entering the homes was pretty simple for him. He had a bunch of different ways that he liked to enter the homes of the victims. He entered the home through various different means, including removing the window pane with a knife, forcing the roll-out window, and pushing the key through the lock. He had weapons and handcuffs with him and carried a kit at all times containing housebreaking implements and restraints. His evidence that he left behind of planning suggests that this offender spent time conducting reconnaissance and surveillance on his victims. And the downfall of so many killers, the trophies. Mr. Cruel stole several distinctive items from his victims, including an Ecuadorian shirt company parka with a fake black fur collar, a gold diamond engagement ring with the number 4132 stamped inside, a classic gold record set by London Philharmonic Orchestra, Rosemary Linus's driver's license, Medicare card, and credit card, a beach bag, a PLC summer uniform, tracksuit pants and a school jumper, and a Melbourne Football Club beanie. So he liked to take these items, but he didn't always take the same item. I don't think any of those items are the same. He liked to take something random from the people he was victimizing. And none of that stuff has ever been found or recovered. But what about the car that he drove? Well, during the December 1988 and July 1990 abductions, Mr. Cruel transported his victims inside of a car. It was a 4-door vehicle with a carpeted floor, bucket seats, a low glove box, and a floor gear shift. The vehicle smelled clean, but sounded old. And, according to the victims, he had trouble starting it. The floor carpet, front door, armrest, and pressed down lock were all cream colored. And he told both of the girls that were inside of the car that the car was stolen, which suggests to some that the car was in fact not stolen. That was another red herring. On the night one of his victims was abducted, a white Commodore Vacationer sedan with 3 blue stripes along the sides was seen acting suspiciously in the nearby area. 3 independent witnesses reported seeing a van by the murder victim's house and a truck near the area where her remains were later discovered, but these were never officially confirmed. But what about the locations of the crimes? Where was Mr. Cruel taking these girls and where was he keeping them held hostage? Well, 2 of Mr. Cruel's victims were able to provide police with details of the house where they had been kept. Descriptions both of the bedroom and the bathroom where they were held captive. Additionally, both Sharon and Nicholas said that the house, unit, or flat had a drive on its right-hand side. Nicholas said that it had 1 step from the drive up into the premises. Both girls were able to occasionally sneak a look inside of the premises, despite warnings not to remove their blindfolds. Sharon described the bedroom that she was being kept in as being the second room from the front door on the right-hand side. She additionally provided the following information to police, sharing that the bedroom had a beige or cream carpet, peachy full-length curtains, a double bed with a peachy orange bedhead, a white Duna with patterns, a peachy orange lamp base, a lemon lampshade with thin white vertical stripes, light colored walls, a brown or black chest of drawers beside the bed, a large window to the right of the bed, and a second chest of drawers to the right of the bed, a wooden tripod set near the end of the bed, probably to film his captives, a radio on the left side of the bed, a metallic type weight near the left side of the bed, and a dark blanket covering a bookcase or cabinet at the opposite end of the room from the bed, possibly to hide identifiable possessions. As for the bathroom of the home, there was a bath, a glass sliding door to the shower, and a wall-mounted pedestal type wash basin adjacent to the shower door. Nicholas said the bath didn't appear to be a full-sized bath and that the separate shower was between the bath and the wash basin. Both girls said that the toilet was in a separate room next to the bathroom and was low to the ground. The toilet had dual flush and the toilet roll holder was on the right when seated on the toilet, and that the door to the toilet opened right to left from the outside. So now that you've heard the story, so now that you know the stories of the victims and the crimes, you know the qualities and properties that you might be able to use to identify who Mr. Cruel was, we need to talk about a few suspects. So, on April 9th, 2016, the Herald Sun newspaper published details of the Spectrum Task Force's dossiers on 7 suspects, known as the Sierra Files, that were produced with the assistance of the US FBI. Detectives had been issued with an instruction in 1991 following the disbandment of the Spectrum Task Force that if another child was abducted, then all of the Sierra Files suspects were to be arrested and questioned. The newspaper also published details of police witness statements from the victims and their families. The dossier provided the following information regarding the 7 suspects. Prime suspect number 1, Brian Elkner. Prime suspect number 1 was supposedly a former Melbourne University lecturer, now aged 82 if he's still alive. He lived in Thornbury at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks, up through when the Herald posted information from the dossiers about the suspects. At that point he moved. Interesting. He was jailed for 10 years in the 1970s after pleading guilty to and other offenses involving attacks at knife point on girls and young women inside of their own homes. Recently retired from his position as a director of his construction design company, back in 2016, he admitted to the Herald Sun that he knows he's the prime suspect, but he denied that he was Mr. Cruel. Additionally, detectives searched his home during their investigation and they found a knife and balaclava hidden in the roof, though he claims he was at his brother's wedding during one of the attacks. So there's no way it could have been him. Elkner was later questioned for 12 hours by detectives during Operation Spectrum and is considered by former Spectrum Task Force head David Sprague more likely than any other suspect to be Mr. Cruel. Now, he seems pretty likely. You got the balaclava and the knife. You have a history of attacking women inside of their own homes with a knife. You were in prison for those crimes. You moved houses, at the same time as some of these things were unfolding. You lived in the nearby area. It's interesting, right? But we have to move on to suspect number 2. Suspect number 2, now close to age 74, lived in nearby Eltham at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks. The father of his former girlfriend still lives at the suspect's Eltham address and recently told the Herald Sun that he has discovered that after moving from Eltham, he lived in several homes in the Box Hill and Surrey Hills areas. He ran a number of businesses in Baldwin and Mount Albert North before moving to live in a caravan park in Lake Cathy, NSW, after marrying a Canadian woman. He left the caravan park in June 2014 and moved to Canada to live with his wife. One of his brothers recently told the Herald Sun that he had lost touch with his sibling, but would try to contact him to tell him that the Herald Sun wanted to speak with him. The Herald Sun itself also reached out to that second suspect, but he never responded. There's also suspect number 3, close to age 76 now in 2025. Mr. Cruel suspect number 3 lives in Musk, where he resided at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks as well. It's also in kind of a nearby area. Suspect number 3 really doesn't want to be tracked down though. He changed his name by deed poll in 1988 and has since changed it again. So he's changed his names twice. He spoke at one point briefly and angrily to the Herald Sun before he ordered the journalist that was trying to ask him questions to leave his property. There's also suspect number 4, who's near 65 years old now, who lived in Harcourt at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks, and while he still does own that house, his neighbors told the Herald Sun that he spends most of his time in Melbourne and only occasionally returns to his Harcourt address. He was unable to be contacted. There's also suspect number 5, who died in 2015 at the age of 66 and lived in Knoxfield at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks. He was married with children and grandchildren when he died, and he worked as a self-employed tradesman. Suspect number 6 is either deceased or around 70 years old. He lived in Baldwin at the time of the Mr. Cruel attacks and has since moved into his mother's Mount Waverly home following her death several years ago. He still lives there. His Baldwin home was demolished and replaced with a 2-story mansion after he sold it. And in 2016, he confirmed to the Herald Sun that he was aware he was a Mr. Cruel suspect, but he obviously denied any involvement in the attacks. I've never had any charges laid against me. I've been interviewed, yes, along with 27,000 other people. I was interviewed, that was it. He was quoted as saying at that time. Suspect number 7 would be 75 years old if he was still alive, and he lived in Glen Iris at the times of the Mr. Cruel attacks. There's been no answer on the many times the Herald Sun knocked on the door of the address he lived in 25 years ago. It's unclear if he was hiding from the newspaper or he just didn't want to speak, or maybe he sold it, maybe he doesn't live there anymore, but neighbors claim they weren't aware of him living there. He also isn't on the electoral roll or in the phone book, and he doesn't use social media, so no one's able to contact this guy. So those are the 7 suspects. I think one definitely stands out, but still, I don't know. Mr. Cruel definitely committed like a perfect crime, leaving no evidence, no footprints, no DNA, no nothing for people to go off of. So even if you really did suspect it was the guy, you would have nothing to base that stuff on. You wouldn't have a DNA to match his DNA to. You wouldn't have anything like that because it doesn't exist. So I don't even know how you would potentially solve this case unless someone finally confessed. In 2020, though, retired homicide detective Ron Idles revealed to the Australian true crime podcast who he believed was Mr. Cruel. According to Idles, a well-known crook who was dying of cancer told him that in around 2003, Mr. Cruel had lived in a house right under the flight path in Eltham with a layout the same way as described by victims, and was by that time already dead. Additionally, it was reported that this person of interest was a successful businessman who frequented the Chan family restaurant and cross-dressed from time to time in his private life. On April 31st, 2022, the Herald Sun journalist Andrew Rule named Ron Idles' informant as dock worker and housebreaker Alfred Hugh Gay, and his suspect as a man named Normie Lee. Normie was a notorious armed robber who was shot dead by the police during a botched robbery attempt at the Melbourne airport in July 1992, just 3 months after the discovery of Carmen Chan's body. Now, according to Rule, Lee confessed to his associate Gay that he had been the one that killed Carmen Chan. Apparently, Gay also told Idles that Lee had a collection of school dresses and owned a house in Napoleon Street, Eltham, with a covered garage that matched the description given by both Sharon and Nicola. There's also a man who could have done it named Robert Keith Knight. Now, Robert Knight was detained in 2013 and had a history that long suggested he could have been Mr. Cruel. He made a living working as a youth worker and school volunteer, but had been arrested on 2 separate occasions for a variety of crimes against children. In 1980 and 1996, Robert Knight had been arrested and convicted for various on minors, and a multitude of other victims had come out of the woodwork following his convictions, claiming that he had them as well. According to the original Operation Spectrum investigators, Robert Knight was one of their suspects who had never quite panned out, but investigators had been unable to eliminate him from contention. He remained a person of interest throughout the following investigations, and the timing of the Mr. Cruel assaults would have coincided with his post-1980 conviction release. And here's another disturbing little tidbit about this guy. After being released from prison from his 1996 conviction in the year 2009, Robert Knight began to immediately amass a collection, a disturbing collection, a collection of thousands of images, and he was later detained in an investigation by Victorian police. He pled guilty, obviously, because of the overwhelming evidence, and while he was awaiting trial, he leaped from a second-story prison railing and unalived himself. He had chosen the easy way out instead of having to confront the truth. So that's interesting too. That's a really weird one. You have a guy who's a criminal predator who has an interest in children, who's in the area at the time. The timing of him being out of prison for similar crimes matches up with the timeline of the crimes. He can never stop himself, and then he takes the secret to the grave. Could he have been involved with the Mr. Cruel murders? I don't know. There are also, though, a couple of weird inconsistencies and strange occurrences that happen throughout this case. For example, in March of 2022, 60 Minutes Australia reported that a woman who was friends and neighbors with one of the victims had come forward to report information regarding Mr. Cruel. Take a look at this clip.
Their homes backed onto a cleared right-of-way for high-tension electrical towers.
It's a private area for power lines. You'd have to know it was there. You could look at either end of that street and not know it was there. That's how secluded this area is. You only would be there if you know about it. But say mowing under the power lines or maintenance, only someone who knew those power lines and the access it had to the houses on the back fence, because you can see over the fence without anyone noticing what you're doing. My brothers always played football and cricket under the power lines, and they were the only people up there all the time. So they were up there one day and they saw a man filming over victim two's back fence, video cameraing with a JVC video camera over the back fence. So he was struggling to make it over because he was about 5'9" to 5'10". So he was struggling to kind of reach over to film. So when they came up, he was very shocked that he was caught and he took off. And so this happened prior to the kidnapping. And when the kidnapping happened, my brothers told my mum, and my mum called the police. The police didn't come, but they had the information because they came years later. And when they did come, they were only there for a few minutes. So they didn't take any information from the boys. So this information is all new.
In May of 2023, Daily Mail Australia reported that another woman who believed that she lived right next door to Mr. Cruel claimed that she was being ignored by homicide squad detectives who refused to interview her about the cold case. A Victoria police spokeswoman told the Daily Mail Australia that a homicide squad detective had spoken to the woman over the phone, but had determined that the information that she supplied via Crime Stoppers was not enough to progress the investigation. Mr. Bennett, who in 2022 exposed exposed the official 1991 joint Victoria Police and FBI profile on the case to be flawed, claimed that Victorian detectives needed to interview the woman, saying, "Police should have checked out this lady's story. Just as a matter of good public relations, the police should have done more to check out her story." He said, "I've complained to multiple police chief commissioners that a do-nothing approach loses the narrative to others by default. Since 2016, almost all of the announcements and discoveries on the Mr. Cruel cases have been made by private researchers, general public, witnesses, and/or media. Police have done little and at times been an obstruction to information." He was quoted as saying, Herald Sun journalist Ron Iddles supposedly passed on information to the police regarding Normie Lee, that suspect he had uncovered through that beat-down crook, but the police supposedly never investigated the lead any further, as Mrs. Chan was unable to recognize him. Additionally, Normie Lee had first gained notoriety after being charged, then discharged, of the infamous 1976 Great Bookie robbery. Interestingly, the first words of the masked bandits during that bookie robbery were, "We'll blow your heads off," a phrase used by Mr. Cruel during both the Linus abduction and by Alfie Gay's gang during the 1970 MSS security robbery, for which he was sentenced to 12 years in jail in 1974. Now, curiously, Lee's partner in crime, Normie Lee, the suspect during this botched airport heist in July 1992 when he was shot and killed, was Stephen Asling, who was later suspected of using the same patch of wasteland beside Edgar's Creek in Thomastown where Carmen Chan's body was found in April 1992 to bury Terrence Blewett in 2004. Now, according to a 2018 article in AU News by Rowan Smith, many believe that Mr. Cruel had uncanny, similar behavior to that of the US serial killer and known as the Golden State Killer. Both of these killers took breaks to eat meals, both were armed with a knife and a gun, and both pretended to have conversations with people who weren't there. Both of them also used expert knots to tie up their victims, and additionally, both looked kind of similar. They wore dark balaclavas and had long hair protruding from underneath, and because of that, the police sketches are almost identical. Both crept into homes holding large knives and waited to be found. They'd be in the same age range right now, and both were pathologically meticulous with their crimes. Finally, both of them came under the microscope of the FBI, despite the crimes occurring on opposite sides of the planet. In 1991, following the disappearance of Carmen, the FBI sent a letter to Victoria Police detailing the steps they should take to catch Mr. Cruel, what his interests were, how his relationships played out, and why he attacked when and where he did. The FBI noted that the offender has an intense interest in children. They said, quote, "He will have his own homemade and would typically live in a single-family residence, one with a garage or carport," end quote. The letter, dated April 24th, 1991, stated that if the killer were in a relationship, quote, "the partner would be aware of some dysfunctions," end quote. In 2016, Smith's article related information that the retired LA Sheriff's Department Detective David Gates reached out to suggest that the Golden State Killer closely resembled a man wanted for burglaries in the mid-1980s, who police later discovered had moved to Australia. Now, it should be stated here that the Golden State Killer Joseph D'Angelo has actually been identified. The Golden State Killer himself first struck in 1978 in California with the double murder of Brian and Katie Maggiore in Sacramento. A year later, he broke into the home of Robert Offerman and his girlfriend Deborah Manning, tied them both up, and shot them. And over the next 6 years, he would kill 3 more couples and 2 single women. A number of the murders were in Goleta and Irvine, suggesting that the killer returned to neighborhoods he was familiar with. The FBI suggested that Mr. Cruel did exactly the same thing. Journalist Adam Shand actually made the determination that Victoria Police do in fact have Mr. Cruel's DNA on file from the abduction of a Ringwood schoolgirl in 1988. Over the years, Victoria Police let the media run unchallenged with the line that Mr. Cruel, quote, "was careful not to leave behind any DNA," end quote. That's a twist, right? Well, Mr. Cruel investigator Chris O'Connor told the Herald Sun on November 8, 2013, "Forensic evidence for this particular series of crimes is the leanest I have ever seen," end quote. However, after a close review of Victoria Police's public statements on the case, there was not any instance of police definitely stating that they do not have Mr. Cruel's DNA. Moreover, they declined to comment on the revelations made in the Hunters. Additionally, journalists questioned that with Mr. Cruel's meticulous plans and red herrings, was what they had actually Mr. Cruel's DNA? Or was it possible that he had deliberately left behind someone else's DNA, once again, to throw them off? Interestingly, an anonymous online commenter recently claimed that the police had found a ginger whisker at one of the crime scenes. Until recently, hair strands could not always provide a reliable DNA profile. In particular, rootless hair shaft samples like whiskers pose challenges due to their insufficient amounts of nuclear DNA. Now, traditionally, mitochondrial DNA analysis is used for rootless hair, which is far less precise. Many people share identical mitochondrial DNA sequences, and therefore, it cannot be definitively used to identify a specific individual or suspect. However, it can be used to exclude individuals in the same way that blood groups can. In the last decade, new DNA extraction techniques have made it possible to obtain profiles from degraded or trace samples, just like rootless hairs, with increasing success. So it's likely that the technology has advanced to a point where the police would be able to generate a profile if they did indeed have, and still have, a whisker of Mr. Cruel's. In the abduction of his second victim, Sharon Wills, Mr. Cruel used a copper wire to tie the hands of her parents. Copper wire was expensive and difficult to acquire in the 1980s and 90s, meaning that authorities could look at suspects who had easy access to it. Mr. Cruel may have been working as an electrician in the construction industry, or he may have had access to work sites, where materials like copper wire are more common. Additionally, during the Wills attack, journalist Keith Moore reported in the 2016 article in the Herald Sun that Mr. Cruel had gotten into their house by sliding a newspaper under the back door and pushing out a key that was placed in the keyhole on the inside of the door. Then he pulled the newspaper back out under the door. Michael Whalen noted that he asked a locksmith about this method, and they reported that it would be impossible to do with modern locks, but it had been a technique used by burglars decades in the past. But it certainly indicated a wealth of knowledge that Mr. Cruel supposedly had. So somehow he could see that there was a key on the inside of the lock from some vantage point in the back garden of the Wills residence, or had he been inside of the residence at some point and seen the key in the lock? There were reportedly firemen, journalists, and a photographer inside the residence in July of 1988 after a fire had occurred earlier that year, as reported in a newspaper article written by Paul Cunningham, saying, quote, "The mother of 4 young girls battled desperately to smother a fire in the children's bedroom caused by a faulty electric blanket," end quote. And because those attacks occurred around school holidays, another theory is that he may have been a teacher or someone who worked at a school. According to an FBI report from 1991, quote, "The offender has an intense interest in children, especially children in the age group he is. He will spend a great deal of time with these children in what appears to be selfless dedication to students," end quote. Many believe that the drug connection in regards to the Carmen murder and the spray-painted family car wasn't looked into enough. According to Michael Whalen of Unresolved.me, the task force mishandled many of the case files. Many were misfiled, unorganized, or just went missing. Additionally, one of the vital pieces of evidence that could have led to Mr. Cruel's doorstep, a piece of tape that was used to bind one of his victims, also went missing. It could have been used to recover DNA from Mr. Cruel, but disappeared while it was in police custody. Now, Michael Whalen notes the interesting use of the wooden camera tripod that Mr. Cruel kept in the bedroom that Sharon and Nicola noted was there, saying that such wooden devices were rare in the 1980s and typically owned by professional photographers, surveyors, or cinematographers. Is this related to the photographer that was at the Wills house investigating the fire at their home? Due to missing pieces of crucial evidence, paired with Mr. Cruel's tactical abilities and his knowledge of forensic evidence, many believe now that he may have been involved in law enforcement. I mean, it's possible. It's possible that he would know what investigators would be looking for, which is how he's been able to evade capture for all these years, cleansing his victims of any DNA and removing any vital evidence after the crimes. A picture of the investigation at the electricity substation in Kew, where Linus was released, indicated that detectives had possibly identified at that point a footprint in the grass. The picture shows men in uniform crouched down on the ground and pointing to something in the grass, to which they were measuring with a tape measure. During his own private investigation, Whalen spoke to one of the many men who was accused of being Mr. Cruel, one of the suspects, and the suspect informed him that the first thing the detectives did was measure his feet. And interestingly enough, forensic psychologist Ian Joblin of the Linus case reported a mysterious caller who called him 3 times during one weekend in July of 1990. Ian reported that the caller had knowledge of the investigation that was only supposedly known by Nicola and the police. This caller who called him 3 times also referred to other similar offenses, supposedly the abduction of Sharon Wills and the Lower Plenty attack. Finally, the caller spoke in great detail about the area that Nicola was taken to, what she had eaten that day, and even what she did when she was on the toilet. This all seems like it would have been a very important lead, but it was never really looked into. Nothing ever came from those phone calls. I don't even know if they investigated it. Now, crime profiler John Kelly, in a July 2024 article in The Age, mentioned the curiosity behind Mr. Cruel's choice of location to dump Carmen's body, saying, quote, "Most of the time, killers want to get away from the body as quickly as possible so they can't be connected to the victim. The more miles they put between them and the victim means the more people they put between them and the victim, and the more people equals more possible suspects for police to sort through. So the question is, why did Mr. Cruel pick a burial site where he felt he could spend the time necessary to dig a grave and bury Carmen? It's a place he was very familiar with and a place he believed he would have the safe, ample time to bury Carmen. How could Mr. Cruel be so familiar with the area, and what's the attraction for him there? More recently, people have begun to theorize that Mr. Cruel himself might have resurfaced and been involved in the 2011 abduction of 13-year-old schoolgirl Bung Siraboon. In 2013, detectives announced a $1 million reward for information leading to the person responsible's apprehension and conviction. And as of 2025, Bung, that 11-year-old child, is still missing. It's been over 10 years. As of today, Mr. Cruel's 3 officially confirmed attacks and suspected murder remain unsolved cold cases, which heed hefty rewards. And yet, there's still nothing. Nobody knows anything about Mr. Cruel. To this day, he remains Australia's most wanted criminal. But will Mr. Cruel ever be caught? I don't know. I highly doubt it, but never say never. So, everybody, at the end of the day, what do you think about Mr. Cruel? Who do you think he was? I want your guys' theories in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening to the show, I don't know how you'd leave a comment, but leave me a comment. I want to know some theories because this case is terrifying. A man actually got away with abducting and murdering kids in the 1990s, and he was never caught. He could still be alive today in Australia. More than likely, he is. And there's still no significant leads. It's kind of like a Jack the Ripper type situation where it's like, you explain this guy's past and he seems like he could be a likely guy. But then you explain this person's past and they also seem like they could be a likely guy. And then you think, well, if they're so likely, why have they never been arrested or questioned, properly? Or why has nothing ever been definitively linked to them? And that's because Mr. Cruel was good at what he did. Honestly, it's sad to say, but he was very good at killing and because he didn't leave that evidence. And something that comes up for me in this case is what's up with all the missing evidence? This shows the conspiracy files, but I mean, come on. You have key pieces of evidence in the Mr. Cruel crimes that go missing. You have files that go missing. You have a piece of tape that could have DNA that goes missing. You have these leads that are seemingly purposefully uninvestigated, people with information that are ignored. So then that has me then leaning towards the theory that it could be a law enforcement officer or it could be someone involved with the police. I mean, highly intelligent person. This could have even been somebody from the upper crust of society, an extremely wealthy person with resources. Maybe they owned a second house where they carried out these crimes and they had interior and exterior designers come immediately afterwards and reshape the entire house and make it appear completely different. Obviously, they didn't have a schedule or work to clock into because of these weird times that they carried these attacks out at, but all I can do is hope and pray that one day Mr. Cruel is brought to justice. I mean, we all know that afterwards when he's dead, he's not going to be going anywhere too nice. But yeah, Mr. Cruel. What a crazy story. Anyways, y'all, I will be back next week with another episode of the show. We have some really detailed deep dives coming soon. Remember, if you love what we're doing here, please share this work to everybody that you know. be annoying about it. Post it on Facebook, post it on X, you know, give me a story shout out on Instagram. Anything helps, everybody, because companies don't want these videos like this to be seen. Every little bit counts and helps. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much for watching. I will catch you next Wednesday. Keep that tinfoil hat on, stay suspicious, and I'll see you guys next week.